The Wrong Way Home: Uncovering the Patterns of Cult Behavior in American Society by Arthur J. Deikman. Chapter 7. Exit from the Cult. Cult behavior is present throughout society, but is particularly evident in the military, whose fanatical support of the arms race has led us to the brink of extinction. The wish of military leaders for power and their training and destruction cause them to imagine enemies where there are none and to exaggerate the aggressive intention of others. The military cult attempts to glorify war and is ready to sacrifice millions of lives for the abstraction of victory. Thus, generals and admirals are enthusiasts of nuclear weapons and think of them not much differently than the toy guns they fired gleefully as children. The bigger the better. For this reason, we must be aware of the influence and manipulation employed by the military establishment in order to maintain power and promote war. If we can see what is happening to us, we can take action to prevent them from leading us to nuclear disaster. We are all susceptible to the cult process. Did you agree with what I said above about the military? I was purposely devaluing them, using the same means that cults employ to define an outside group as evil. The attributions I made were exaggerated generalizations. Do you know any high-ranking military officers? It is possible that the paragraph above fits them, but most likely it does not. Consider the phrase, the military, whose fanatic support of the arms race has led us to the brink of extinction. It permits no distinctions among members of the military, no recognition that opinions and motives vary from person to person as in any other group. Such stereotyping cannot account for statements such as this one on nuclear weapons. At the theater or tactical level, any nuclear exchange, however limited it might be, is bound to leave NATO worse off in comparison to the Warsaw Pact, in terms of both military and civilian casualties and destruction. To initiate use of nuclear weapons seems to me criminally irresponsible. The person quoted is Field Marshal Lord Carver, Chief of the British Defence Staff from 1973 to 1976. He is not the only powerful military officer to take that position. Admiral Hyman Rickover, the principal force behind the development of the nuclear submarine fleet, on the occasion of his retirement, advocated doing away with nuclear weapons and nuclear reactors as well. The most important thing we could do is start by having an international meeting where we first outlaw nuclear weapons. And then we outlaw nuclear reactors too. I think it would be the finest thing in the world for the President of the United States to immediately initiate another disarmament conference. This is very propitious. This is a very propitious time when the military expenses are eating up so much of the people's taxes. Nor is Rickover an exception among the American military. Jean LaRocque, another retired admiral, is a leading speaker for Physicians for Social Responsibility and heads the Center for Defense Information, a peace movement organization. And what are we to make of the fact that in May 1982, the entire Joint Chiefs of Staff supported reductions in strategic nuclear arsenals in opposition to the Secretary of Defense, Caspar Weinberger, a civilian? Around the same time, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs supported the peace movement in its pressure for arms control. Opponents of nuclear weapons in the United States are not a fringe element, but contain many who support a strong military and still want to get on with some arms control that is meaningful and results in very substantial reductions. The military acted as a moderating force when the Joint Chiefs of Staff opposed President Reagan's wish to send a battleship group to South America. My use of the term fanatical denigrates and devalues the opposing view by attacking the character of the opponent rather than addressing the content of what is proposed. A fanatic is a person possessed by an excessive and irrational zeal, especially for a religious or political cause. With the use of this term, advocacy of arms buildup becomes irrational zeal, without the writer having to prove that it is so. My demonstration paragraph contains no attempt to understand what legitimate basis might exist for the military's advocacy of an increased arms budget. That viewpoint is only condemned or devalued. The fact is, a general or an admiral might believe that a nuclear war would be an utter disaster for his country, but that an increased arms budget would help guard against such a war. And it is at least possible that such thinking might be correct. Some generals argue strongly for building up conventional forces rather than nuclear arms. The sample paragraph given above does not acknowledge or discriminate among these possibilities. Instead, it attempts to establish a separate class of human beings, the military, characterized as wrong or bad. People not like us. The reader is always included in the us, because in cult communication, us means good. We usually do not challenge such an inclusion even though its purpose is to exclude someone else, to lead us to regard them as bad, or at least inferior. This is a typical illustration of devaluation as it occurs in everyday life. The second sentence of the paragraph establishes that the military has bad motives. The wish of military leaders for power and their training and destruction causes them to imagine enemies where there are none and to exaggerate the aggressive intention of others. Thus, they want power and destruction are paranoid to boot. The problem with the statement is projection. The sentence implies that the bad traits it designates characterize the military rather than anyone else, not the writer, and by unspoken agreement, not the reader. That implication is clearly false. A keen interest in violence and destruction can be found in almost everyone. Witness the continued popularity of shoot-'em-up, beat-'em-up television and movie entertainment, in what seems to be the favorite plot. The villain has to be so bad that the hero has license to behave brutally, cruelly, and vindictively, violating all precepts of fairness or legality in the process. Judging by the Nielsen ratings, military personnel do not comprise the total audience for such bloodfests. The capacity for violence, physical or psychological, is present in all human beings. At the same time, everyone thinks of themselves as having good intentions. Indeed, after many years as a psychiatrist, it is clear to me that most human beings, especially those whose behavior is abhorrent, are likely to think of themselves as victims rather than villains, misunderstood by others, not appreciated, treated unfairly, not deserving the hardships encountered. It is doubtful that anyone rises in the morning exclaiming, "Aha! Another day to be evil." The wish for personal power is also universal and not confined to the military. As a liberal, I have attended many peace movement meetings and have observed that being on a platform brings out the demagogue in many speakers and leaders, whether of the right, left, or center. I myself enjoy giving lectures to large groups of people and still remember one gathering of 1,000 that responded with such enthusiasm that I could understand how Benito Mussolini must have felt when he spoke from his balcony. Power, vanity, and greed can flower exuberantly even while high-minded words are being disclaimed. I haven't attended any conservative or right-wing rallies, but have observed them on television and read the speeches delivered there. The effect of the platform on the speaker is the same. The second sentence of our sample attributes a paranoid perspective to the generals and admirals, to imagine enemies where there are none. Quite possibly, this does occur in the military, depending on the person and the circumstances, but this too is true of everyone else. Indeed, paranoia depends on attributing to someone or some group precisely those traits one denies in oneself, and the reader who accepted the opening paragraph did just that. The paragraph offers a good example of unnoticed, everyday projection, a basic cult dynamic. In this example, the generals and the admirals are the focus of projection, but just as often, the peace movement, the doves, the left, are designated as bad, inferior, irresponsible. An interesting exercise is to consult the newspaper columnists, magazines, or television commentators that are your preferred sources of information and notice the devaluation and projection that is employed with your tacit approval. When Washington politics, the Soviet Union, nuclear war, or other controversial subjects are discussed, the devaluation reinforces your sense of rightness and establishes a clear source of evil. Also observe the tone of righteousness that accompanies such cult behavior. It signals the presence of projection. They are bad, we are good. You may notice in yourself the fantasy that if you were in power, things would be done right. The last two sentences of the chapter's opening paragraph sound a warning that is true enough. We must be aware of the devices of influence and manipulation employed. But that applies to everyone: the military, the peace movement, the left, the right, blacks and whites, Jews, Christians, Muslims, rich and poor. The military is authoritarian by nature and will inevitably manifest some of the cult behavior we have seen in religions, large corporations, and other social institutions. What is most important is that each of us become more aware of his or her own cult thinking. Only through such awareness can we extricate ourselves from the invisible, everyday cults of which we are members. The opening paragraph of this chapter was written to provide an experience of cult thinking by appealing to and stimulating the reader's likely prejudices, fears, and wishes. I use such a device because personal bias tends to make influence and manipulation invisible to those affected. If you are a member of the military or a hardline conservative, you may not have been swayed. However, for many of us, characterizing generals and admirals as warmongering, stupid, or callous fits our projections very nicely. We consider ourselves, in contrast, to be peace-loving, intelligent, and empathetic. We cannot grant laudable characteristics to people advocating very different views without raising the possibility that they could be correct and we in error. Your response may be, "That's nothing new. I know all that." Indeed, the concept of cult behavior can be easily grasped. But experiencing it in one's own thinking and behavior is a different matter. Intellectuals in particular, who are trained not to be caught off balance by any idea, may find the concepts of cult psychology overly familiar, and yet continue with their own cult behavior and be as ignorant of it as the members of Life Force. If you still feel immune from cult influence, can I offer a checklist of everyday behaviors that you may recognize all too well? 1. Speaking of adversaries or outsiders: conservatives, liberals, yuppies, blue-collar, rich, poor, as if they were all the same, characterizing them by negative traits only, attributing unflattering motives to them, but not to oneself. 2. Lacking interest and information concerning the actual statements and actions of opponents or outsiders. 3. Failing to consider the possible validity of an adversary's point of view. 4. Not taking a critical look at one's own position. 5. Disapproving or rejecting a member of one's group for departing from the group position, devaluing the dissident, regarding him or her as an annoyance or a problem. 6. feeling self-righteous. Exit from the invisible cult is very important because cult thinking has such serious consequences, especially at the government level. In her book, March of Folly, Barbara Tuchman presents striking examples of both ancient and modern governments that persisted in disastrous policies while ignoring correct advice and countervailing experience. She blames this primarily on wooden-headedness. Wooden-headedness, the source of self-deception, is a factor that plays a remarkably large role in government and consists in assessing a situation in terms of preconceived fixed notions, while ignoring or rejecting any contrary signs. It is acting according to wish while not allowing oneself to be deflected by the facts. We can recognize here a description of one of the basic cult behaviors, avoiding dissenting views. Correspondingly, in Tuchman's list of requirements for reasonable leadership, we see the opposite: a readiness to learn, to acknowledge error, to keep well informed, to heed information. If the mind is open enough to perceive that a given policy is harming rather than serving self-interest, and self-confident enough to acknowledge it, and wise enough to reverse it. The only hope Tuchman sees for averting further government folly is that the electorate be educated to select leaders by recognizing and rewarding integrity of character, moral courage, and rejecting the ersatz. She's not sanguine about this possibility and concludes, somewhat helplessly, we can only muddle on. Actually, we are not that helpless. The study of cult psychology and its manifestations in ordinary life provides a framework with which to understand why wooden-headedness exists, what the behavior of a competent leader is, and how we can educate both leaders and electorate to do more than muddle on. The necessary information is available if we allow ourselves the awareness of our wish for shepherds, our longing for the backseat of the car. Then we have a much better chance of avoiding folly. Beyond heightening such awareness, there are some specific ways to reduce cult behavior in society. One of the most effective would be to promote anti-authoritarian education. As I've argued, our initial social experience in the family sets the pattern for the roles of leader and follower, and we readily create a parent out of anyone who seeks to lead, teach, or command. We elevate such a person just as we looked up to our parents who were literally above us. Authoritarian leaders stimulate and intensify this response. A young child's critical evaluation of his or her parents is very difficult because the child's understanding is limited by an egocentric view that relates all events to himself or herself as cause. A child cannot comprehend the network of forces affecting parents and their society. Furthermore, critical evaluation may be hazardous and frightening. When a child accurately perceives hypocrisy, selfishness, or irrationality in the parent, and says so, he or she risks punishment. And the parent's withdrawal. Even the awareness of a parent's bad actions may be intolerable, for the parent is the young child's world, and if the world is bad, what hope can be maintained? For this reason, children often regard themselves as bad rather than see the failings of a mother or father. In adulthood, when faced with the harmful behavior of an idealized leader, reality may again be denied. The fact is, the capacity for objective assessment of leaders and authorities is not developed in many homes or schools. Although historical figures or current political leaders may be discussed, the role and power of parents and teachers seldom is. Authorities of any kind rarely encourage an objective appraisal of themselves. In consequence, as adults, we may be vulnerable to the unrealistic claims of charismatic authoritarian leaders. But this can be changed, if we wish. And the place to begin is in the schools. For educational institutions to give up authoritarian power and abandon indoctrination may seem impossible. But the research of Gerda Lederer and others on post-World War II German youth provides evidence that such a goal is achievable. After World War II, authoritarianism, defined by Lederer as readiness to submit to authority combined with a readiness to dominate those with less power, was recognized as an important factor in the rise of the Nazis and the willingness of German citizens to follow wherever Hitler led. Beginning in the 1960s, a deliberate effort was made in West Germany to reduce or eliminate the authoritarian attitude. Most of the Nazi-era school teachers were dismissed because of party membership. Most of the old textbooks were destroyed. Beyond that, educational leaders set out to do what had not been done after World War I, during the Weimar Republic. Totally change the atmosphere of the schools so as to practice democratic values as well as preach them. When Lederer arrived in West Germany to do her research, originally on the difference in math scores between American and German students, she was required to take a month-long teacher training course. The training emphasized that the students, not the teachers, should do most of the talking in the classroom. "We do not use the frontal approach in teaching," the German instructor said. "We don't expect your students to be quiet and listen. The students should be encouraged to talk among themselves," he added. The atmosphere was so different from the stereotype of German discipline that Lederer felt like Alice in Wonderland. In 1978, using a carefully constructed questionnaire, she found that, in contrast to the findings in 1945, West German adolescents were on par with American adolescents with regard to authoritarianism. Both groups had shown a significant reduction in authoritarian beliefs between 1945 and 1978. But the West Germans' change had been more dramatic. Where there were differences in 1978, the West German adolescents showed a greater support for democratic values than did the American students. The poll research confirmed the similar findings of a massive, multinational study conducted in 1971 by the International Association for the Evaluation of Educational Achievement, IEA. This apparent successful effort on the part of West German authorities to teach anti-authoritarianism suggests that schools can encourage students to examine the roots of their automatic obedience to authority and of automatic rebellion as well. Considered most broadly, this could be seen as an education in anti-cult psychology. However, it must be recognized that teaching students to perceive and understand the operations of authoritarianism requires more than the establishment of a democratic classroom. I believe that the process of observation and reflection should be applied to the reactions of students and teachers to the social structures of their own educational milieu, of their peer groups, of their families. They would need to learn about the indoctrination and bias present in their society, which is communicated directly via news and opinion sources and indirectly via entertainment and advertising. Then they would be in a position to study cults per se and relate them to themselves. They would begin to understand the forces shaping their beliefs and values. In the words of Idries Shah, people are widely held to have the right to attack what they dislike. We have not yet, however, reached the stage where it is required that people understand, though they purport to describe, the roots of liking and disliking. Allied to anti-authoritarian education is the fostering of autonomy in various sectors of society, which can also help limit the extent of cult behavior by encouraging the expression in action of multiple individual viewpoints. Autonomy is a mark of adulthood, whereas subservience and automatic deference are marks of childlike dependency. As we have seen, cults regress their members to a stage of dependency on the group and childlike expectations of the leader, who is elevated far above the followers and regarded as if he or she were infinitely wise. The issue of autonomy is important in the corporate world. The most successful companies appear to have achieved a balance between autonomy and centralized control such that neither dimension gets out of hand. Alfred Sloan at General Motors had such a goal. A delicate balance was to be maintained between the freedom of various operations to manage their business, competing internally as well as outside the company, and the controls necessary to coordinate these operations in the best interest of the corporation's growth and performance. The Japanese have been very successful at achieving a similar balance. An executive of one of Japan's largest suppliers of electrical products described their approach. Matsushita fosters autonomy and provides enormous incentives for group and individual performance. But Matsushita exercises extraordinarily tight control over a few variables. The planning process, and in particular, the 6-month operating plan, are taken very seriously. Matsushita believes that people can be trusted. However, our control systems provide guidelines to prevent ruinous mistakes. Another company, Schlumberger, provides us with clear examples of how autonomy is given employees and how much they value it. In the words of several of their field engineers, "The thing that drew me here was that no other job gives you the responsibility you are given here right out of school. I have much more responsibility than I would in other jobs. The technical side is quite interesting. The engineer has his own unit, his own tools, his own team. I joined because I wanted to go overseas and have my own show. I have the impression that I'm running my own company." The excellent company studied by Peters and Waterman all work to treat their employees with respect, to regard them as adults rather than unruly, lazy children. Initiative, autonomous decision-making, and constructive disagreement were encouraged. Sloan's genius at General Motors was to organize independent divisions in control of their own operations, but responsive to headquarters' long-range planning. After Sloan, more and more decision-making was taken over by a headquarters staff that had less and less experience in the manufacture and sale of automobiles. Multiple committees intervened to delay decisions and thereby lose both opportunities and money. The informed voter is supposed to be the feedback of democracy, but in an interesting study of citizen voting habits done in the 1950s suggests that the rational, objectively interested citizen does not really exist. The researchers concluded that it is the ill-informed, relatively indifferent voters who are essential for a liberal democracy, that only they are responsive to the changing conditions, providing flexibility to the body politic. The well-informed, highly interested, involved citizen is usually quite partisan and unmoved by argument, on the left and the right. Such stalwarts anchor the political ship, providing stability. Highly interested voters vote more, and know more about the campaign, and read and listen more, and participate more. However, they are also less open to persuasion and less likely to change. Extreme interest goes with extreme partisanship, and might culminate in rigid fanaticism that could destroy the democratic process if generalized throughout the community. This somewhat disconcerting finding is due in part to the fact that what informs the citizen is largely propaganda issuing from one side or the other. Radio, television, magazines, and newspapers feature both critics and defenders of a particular policy, but each of these selects facts useful to his or her position, emphasizes certain principles, and ignores others, even evoking emotional responses, prejudices, and fears. After reading or hearing such a presentation, one may be persuaded, influenced, or won over, but one is not really better informed if what one has encountered is not essential information, but convincing propaganda. Unless the audience knows a great deal about the subject, one-sided presentations can be very persuasive. In most conflict situations, disagreements are based on differences in interpretation and in the priorities given to different values, but these differences are seldom stated, and, lacking that clarification, we absorb highly selective information, are swayed to one side or the other, but end up no wiser. As Jacques Ellul points out, whether propaganda is democratic or totalitarian does not matter. Choice and discrimination are damaged. The existence of two contradictory propagandas is no solution at all. The individual is not independent in the presence of two combatants between whom he must choose. He is not a spectator comparing two posters, or a supreme arbiter when he decides in favor of the more honest and convincing one. The individual is seized, manipulated, attacked from every side. The combatants of the two propaganda systems do not fight each other, but try to capture him. Opposing propagandas do not assist the democratic process, but produce partisans, each with the mindset of a cult member who demands simple solutions, catchwords, certainties, continuity, commitment, a clear and simple division of the world into good and evil. Efficiency and unit of thought. He cannot bear ambiguity. He cannot bear that the opponent should in any way whatsoever, whatever, represent what is right or good. The individual will escape either into passivity or into total and unthinking support of one of the two sides. In order for the citizen to exercise a realistic choice, a more searching alternative is needed. On making use of dissent as a way of raising the level of informed judgment without raising the level of partisanship. Let us imagine a debate or discussion, the goal of which is to clarify a controversial problem and propose solution. The focus would be on the fundamental question of how the data are interpreted and what values are given priority. The intent would not be to overwhelm or capture the audience, but to clarify the competing values that are involved in the conflict and in the proposed solutions. In this way, we could become informed without becoming opinionated. Logically, 4 areas would be clarified. 1. The key data. Are they disputed? 2. Interpretations of the data. 3. Value conflicts. Reasons for giving one value priority over the other. 4. Error indicators. What events or facts would indicate to each side that their belief or strategy should be changed? The best corporate executives promote real dissent even though they may find it irritating. Harold Guinan, who ruled ITT like an absolute monarch, was nevertheless quite clear about the importance of dissent and said that he deliberately fostered it in his search for the unshakable facts. We cut through layers of fat in our management ranks by putting all the people in one room so they could talk with one another face to face, regardless of rank. And an honest assessment of any situation could be based upon the facts which emerged. But that is only the surface of the matter. Beneath that surface was the clear understanding that we owed each other our honest opinions at all times. People could disagree with me or with anyone else. They could criticize me or anyone else, and no one would suffer as a consequence. I tried to welcome criticism. Naturally, no one likes to be criticized. One's first instinct is to be defensive and fight back. But that is the kind of defensiveness one should try to keep under control. I consciously tried to lean over backwards to avoid bridling. When someone disagreed with me, I always wanted someone to point out where I might be heading for a mistake, and never batted down such a man. I listened and we exchanged views. But more important than the encounter itself was that at meetings others observed what was happening and word got around the company that one could speak his mind, disagree with the boss, and be heard. Keenan's description of himself received support from ITT executives whom Pascal and Athos interviewed. Keenan didn't mistrust people in a misanthropic sense, says one senior level manager, but he did mistrust a single source. Keenan disliked relying on one perspective as the means for getting him the whole picture. He believed that people have different points of view and that it is dangerous to listen to one small coterie. Referring to a face-to-face confrontation, referring to the face-to-face confrontations that were encouraged at large executive meetings. It was like a tennis match. You could play an aggressive game with your opponent, but still have a relationship with him when the game was over. Jean Ribaud, when CEO of Schlumberger, picked key people who were not afraid to disagree with him. People who had the courage of their convictions, who did not float like a cork, but forced people to think. Ed Carlson, who was CEO of United Airlines, also valued dissent. When Carlson was in accord with his advisors, he might play devil's advocate to see if he could support the opposite side with logic. He sought the difference of opinion among his executives, said one observer. And anyone in the group was expected to disagree loudly if he felt so disposed. Carlson's only rule: disagree without being disagreeable. Contrast these attitudes with those of the General Motors executives described by DeLorean, or the imperial manner of Henry Ford II, as described by Lee Iacocca in his autobiography, or the behavior of key executives during the TV cable news fiasco. Inhibiting dissent can be as costly in the industry as it is in cults. Fostering dissent and recognizing its value are essential to realistic decision-making. It is true that authoritarian decision-makers who dispense with dissent can be right in their decisions, but they can also be very wrong. General Douglas MacArthur showed brilliant independent judgment during the Korean War in his insistence on an amphibious assault of Incheon, despite the unanimous objection of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. In that case, he was right. However, according to historian William Manchester, MacArthur's equally strong belief during World War II that he would defeat the Japanese on the Lingayen beaches northwest of Manila led him to delay shifting vast stores of food and supplies to Bataan as originally planned by the Joint Chiefs for a retreat and holding action. Finally, when it was too late to supply the peninsula, MacArthur retreated, but the troops, who otherwise would have been able to hold out for years, were starved into surrender and most died on the death march. Today, nuclear weapons have made the stakes of government decision-making higher than in the past. Only responsible dissent voiced and listened to can offer protection against cataclysmic error. With this need in mind, Irving Janis has suggested adopting procedures aimed at facilitating dissent in government. Among the steps he recommends are: assign the role of critical evaluator to each member of a policy-making group, encouraging the group to give high priority to airing objections and doubts, the setting up of several independent policy-making and evaluation groups to work on the same policy question, each carrying out its deliberations under a different leader. One or more outside experts or qualified colleagues who are not core members of the policymaking group should be invited to each meeting on a staggered basis and should be encouraged to challenge the views of the core members. At least one member should be assigned to the role of devil's advocate. Janis recognizes the risks and difficulties in implementing his proposals, yet the steps outlined above would clearly be helpful in encouraging constructive dissent and lessening cult-like behavior at the highest levels of government. We can be confident that these procedures are practical because they have been used successfully already. Following the Bay of Pigs disaster, President Kennedy sought to understand why his administration had blundered so badly, and when the next crisis occurred, he put a much different system into operation. In October of 1962, the discovery that the Soviet Union was installing nuclear missiles in Cuba spurred Kennedy to convene a group of high-level advisors to decide how to deal with the threat. 5 of the key men selected had participated in the Bay of Pigs planning group: Rusk, McNamara, Dillon, Bundy, and Robert Kennedy. As before, they met under great time pressure, for they believed it was essential to take action before the missile sites became operational. Rightly or wrongly, Kennedy ruled out a diplomatic approach. He made it clear that the situation was unacceptable and that the group task was to decide on the best form of coercive action to force the removal of the missiles from Cuba. This time, the team did not try to satisfy an impatient president by obtaining a quick consensus. They reacted quite differently, not only because they remembered what had happened at the Bay of Pigs, but because Kennedy saw to it that their deliberations took place under quite different procedures. Each participant was expected to function as an independent critical thinker, addressing the problem in its entirety and not primarily as a spokesperson for the agency they represented. Robert Kennedy and Theodore Sorensen were given special roles to guard the group against superficial analysis. No formal agenda was imposed. Discussions were free and far-ranging. Outside experts were invited to give opinions and then were questioned closely. If visitors to the group remained silent, they were specifically asked to state their observations and comments. Subgroups were formed to work independently on the same problem and then met to compare their findings. From time to time, President Kennedy absented himself from the group, especially in the early phases when many different alternatives were first considered. As an example of the results of this different process, Robert Kennedy, who during the Bay of Pigs discussion had chided his dissenters, this time guarded against premature closure of options. When an airstrike was proposed as the only option, he advised reconsideration. Surely, he asserted, there must be some course in between bombings and doing nothing. By the end of the first day of the meetings, the committee had seriously discussed at least 10 alternatives. There was no false confidence, no shoving aside of the frightful risks that attended each option. The participants were encouraged to challenge each other's assumptions, to speak their minds frankly, and treat each other, as well as the outside visitors and consultants, as equals. Dissent was recognized as vital to finding a way to the most realistic action. This process was often stressful for committee members, leading to unpleasant arguments, agitation, and sleepless nights. The discussions went on for days and seemed interminable, but in the end, the blockade plan was decided upon. Furthermore, contingency plans were worked out in full detail to cope with a variety of possible Soviet responses. Nothing was taken for granted. As a result of the thorough review of all the drawbacks, emphasis added, the recommendations the group gave to the president included much more than strategic military guidelines. The group worked out in considerable detail ways of handling a variety of political, legal, and diplomatic ramifications which, if neglected, could cause a blockade attempt to fail. The contrast to the Bay of Pig deliberations is striking. Even if the blockade had not worked, the chances of success had been maximized, and the contingency responses were thought through and put in place. The practice of welcoming dissent, uncomfortable and disconcerting as it can be, proved immensely practical. Unfortunately, it seems that presidents do not always learn from their predecessors. After the Tower report on the Iran-Contra affair was released, Senator Nancy Kassebaum, a Republican member of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, commented, "The underlying problem is all this lack of respect for dissent. The president has not been able to hear all sides of an issue. And we saw the same thing on SDI, Contra aid, South Africa, and of course, the budget. People in the administration who challenge policy are shunted aside. That's the basic flaw in the process." Eye-level world. Probably the most common everyday cult behavior is devaluation of the outsider. As discussed earlier, we do this not only to feel superior, but also as a defense against recognizing those things in ourselves about which we feel ashamed and inferior. Human beings tend to see someone else as embodying the defects they themselves deny. This projection of badness interferes with realistic assessment of another's intentions. Frequently, it serves to justify violence. In contrast, an eye-level view recognizes defects and hurtful actions in the other without adopting a superior position or lowering the other to subhuman status. In the service of realism, it is important to diminish projection and establish an eye-level perspective. For in our fears, hopes, and capacity for nobility, as well as self-deception, we can recognize each other, see that the enemy is us. Measures that reveal our similarities to the outsider, not just our differences, are very helpful. The reader may object that such perceptions of the hostile outsider must be mutual, that if we perceive the humanness and the similarity of our enemies while they do not so perceive us, then we are at a fatal disadvantage. This is simply not so. Perceiving the other person without the distortion imposed by projection permits us to see more clearly, to respond more realistically. That response might be either aggressive or conciliatory, depending upon which is called for by the reality of the situation, not by the product of a projective defenses. Such realism is always an advantage, especially in our dealings with other nations, other people, like the foreigner. At such times, cult behavior is likely to be most intense and mutual recognition most memorable. 40 years after the Allied landing in France, an American soldier recalled that time. Aruda nodded, his hands touching the green napkin with its rough map of a 40-year-old battlefield. "I'd like to go back to the places I landed, the places I fought," he said, "to the city of Cherbourg." And maybe he could find the spot in the field outside St. Lô, where he stood up at the same time as a German officer who was only a few feet away. "We looked at each other for the longest time, just staring," said Aruda. "I knew he had troops behind him, and he knew my people were back there. I was thinking, hey, this son of a bitch is just like me. And we both of us turned around and very slowly walked away from each other." How can this eye-level perception be fostered? As we know from experience, actual contact helps greatly. If the contact occurs with enough informality for the participants' humanity to emerge, at the international level, citizens' exchanges between countries, involvement in joint works projects, and shared living are all moves in the right direction. Unfortunately, the people who participate in such activities usually do not occupy positions in the higher echelons of government, although those leaders need to experience more than anyone else high-level contact, frequently and for days at a time, is one thing that might cost little but could significantly reduce projection. Such extended personal meetings resulted in Ronald Reagan's stroll in Red Square with his arm around the shoulders of Mikhail Gorbachev. The evil empire relegated to another time, another era. In many situations, eye-level perception can be enhanced by using encounter group techniques developed in the 60s and early 70s to increase the depth of communication among group members. Carl Rogers used these techniques successfully to promote understanding between antagonistic national groups. I believe they could be utilized to make perception more realistic between opposing factions at all levels. Increasing the range of tools with which national and international problems might be resolved would certainly be desirable. Mahatma Gandhi was successful in achieving political change through nonviolent civil disobedience. He served as a model for Kaunda in Zambia, Martin Luther King in Montgomery, Alabama, and many others. Gandhi's principles of action were the opposite of cult behavior. He stressed putting oneself in the place of the opponent, respecting his or her potential goodness, and recognizing that you may be in error. Gandhi was quite explicit about what was required. I want you to feel like loving your opponents, and the way to do that is to give them same credit for honesty of purpose which you would claim for yourself. It is true that they have their ends to serve, but so we have our ends to serve. Only we consider our ends to be pure and therefore selfless. But who are we to determine where selflessness ends and selfishness begins? Immediately we begin to think of things as our opponents think of them. We shall be able to do them full justice. 3/4 of the miseries and misunderstandings in the world will disappear if we step into the shoes of our adversaries and understand their standpoint. These principles directly combat devaluation and aim at establishing eye-level relationships that eliminate all self-righteousness. Gandhi went further and stressed that humiliation of the opponent was not permissible. Great care was to be taken to maintain the opponent's dignity and self-respect. At every step, Gandhi was concerned that the opponent save face, and this concern was a tribute to his realism. General Smuts remarked after experiencing Gandhi in South Africa, "It was my fate to be the antagonist of a man for whom even then I had the highest respect. He never forgot the human background of the situation." Unfortunately, the vast majority of Gandhi's followers venerated him as a saint to the detriment of the eye-level relationship he advocated in dealing with adversaries. They responded to him as a parrot, Bapu, with the dependency dynamics outlined for cults. As Erik Erikson's study made clear, Gandhi was quite capable of being authoritarian, tyrannical, and unjust to his own immediate family and disciples. Everyone, even one called saint or genius, is flawed. The failure of Gandhi, like the failure of every great mass leader in human history, was not in having flaws, but in not freeing his followers from cult behavior. The awful violence between Muslims and Hindus that took place during his lifetime and afterwards was a typical product of cult psychology. In the name of religions that advocate justice, mercy, generosity, and humility, the most barbarous atrocities were committed by each group against the other. Gandhi could stop them by fasting, but when Gandhi was gone, most showed they had learned nothing. Characteristically, cults subordinate ethical and moral standards to the particular aims of the group and leader. These are called higher purposes, usually put in terms of saving the world, as when the needs of Clara's child were made secondary to the needs of life force. In political situations in America, saving the world for democracy, overthrowing communism, fighting terrorism, or the war on drugs are cited to justify illegal and immoral actions taken by the government. Undoubtedly, situations arise in which hard choices must be made, but often government officials use higher purposes to justify unsavory operations that are remarkably ineffective, if not disastrous. The internment of the Japanese in 1942, the Bay of Pigs, the Tonkin Gulf incident, the bombings in Cambodia, the overthrow of Adelante, and the sale of arms to Iran, among many others. Cult thinking is seldom realistic. In contrast, the deliberations on the Cuban Missile Crisis Planning Group were guided by a basic approach strikingly consistent with Gandhi's, one which included concern for the ethics of any proposed action, putting oneself in the opponent's place, and being careful to avoid humiliating him. The first days of the Missile Crisis Group's discussion were occupied with the morality of an airstrike against the Cuban bases. This proposal, advanced by the military, was at first favored by President Kennedy and Douglas Dillon. However, George Ball vigorously objected that such a surprise attack would be counter to your own traditions and harm our moral standing. Robert Kennedy agreed, pointing out the loss of innocent lives that would result in that such an action would be a Pearl Harbor in reverse, going against our humanitarian ideals. Robert McNamara also agreed, and in his retrospective account makes it clear that Robert Kennedy's stress on moral values was an important influence which resulted in the abandonment of the airstrike option in favor of a blockade. Robert Kennedy's, contribution was far more than administrative. He opposed a massive surprise attack of a large country on a small country because he believed such an attack to be inhuman, contrary to our traditions and ideals, and an act of brutality for which the world would never forgive us. In practice, realpolitik, which ignores ethical considerations, usually is cult-like in that it is linked to a devaluation of the enemy, to stereotyping and self-righteousness. In contrast, realism requires putting oneself in one's opponent's place, and if one is to understand and predict the opponent's actions, in typical Gandhi fashion, the Cuban Missile Group did just that. Most members viewed their opposite numbers in the Kremlin as no less rational than themselves. Often the members of the group set themselves the task of trying to predict how the enemy would react to one or another course of action by deliberately trying to imagine themselves in the Soviet leader's place. Without denying them the cunning and deceit of the Soviet leaders, the group adopted the working assumption that the Soviet Union would not be likely to initiate a war unless unduly provoked. Rusk and other members urged the group to choose a response that the Soviet leaders could clearly see offered them a way out. An important argument that led the group to regard a naval blockade as much more prudent than any alternative military response was precisely that this low-level action could serve as an unmistakable indication of America's strong intention to eliminate the missile bases without confronting the Soviet leaders, with a belligerent act that would be sudden or humiliating. Avoiding situations that would embarrass the Soviets was an important strategic consideration. Consequently, the first ship boarded was not Soviet, but a Lebanese freighter under charter to the Soviets. At every step, including American replies to Soviet proposals, care was taken to avoid provocative, unduly threatening, or humiliating actions. Robert Kennedy concluded, A final lesson of the Cuban Missile Crisis is the importance of placing ourselves in the other country's shoes. Gandhi would agree. Two primary cult behaviors, compliance with the group and dependence on a leader, have served necessary functions in the survival of the human race. They are very important in childhood, where they provide safety, security, encouragement, and support. Groups and leaders have legitimate functions for their adults as well. They can stimulate, reinforce, and guide individuals' energies in constructive ways. They provide meaning and counter isolation and loneliness with acceptance and warmth. But the fantasy of parents must be transcended by adults. For us, it is no longer function. Indeed, regressive dependency makes our survival and progress more difficult because reality must be distorted in order to construct shepherds out of sheep. Adult human beings stand together in a horizontal plane, but they all too often try to organize it vertically. The reader may assume that the eye-level world in his or her perspective The reader may assume that the eye-level world is his or her basic perspective. It hasn't been for me. Whenever I gave a public lecture, I noticed that immediately afterwards I felt left down, disappointed, no matter how well the audience had responded. Eventually, I realized that I was preparing my lectures as if the authority figures of my early professional years would be listening. At the periphery of my mind was an image of them seated in the back of the auditorium. There were no specific faces, just a row of skeptical shadows. I worked hard at shaping and rehearsing my lectures to convince them of the rightness of my views, to win their approval, their grudging admiration. But when I stepped up on the platform and looked over the audience, I could see that they weren't there. They hadn't come. This fantasy of fathers, this vertical perspective, had been hidden from me until my disappointment alerted me to it. I know I am not alone in this. I can recognize the persistence of what I call the parent world in the attitude and behavior of my friends, in the implicit views of authors whose books I read, and in the statements of public figures. As a psychotherapist, I find the parent world in the fantasies of people with normal and useful adult positions. Teachers, housewives, carpenters, lawyers, executives, students, people in all the occupations that comprise everyday society. The evidence is strong that all of us show the effects of having been raised in a hierarchical world in which there were those above us and those below. From such a perspective, there is always a higher authority. Perhaps I can bring this home with another demonstration. Morality is usually experienced as a given, as a code whose violation brings punishment or at least guilt. Most people, if they look within, discover a subtle fantasy that someone or something is keeping score of their good and bad deeds, and that in the future, usually after death, there will be a settling up. If you doubt this, try an experiment. Imagine that there will be no ultimate retribution for anything you do, no denial of heaven to be wicked. Imagine that whether you behave like a saint or a sadist, are kind or cruel, generous or selfish, it will make no difference when you die. How you behave is entirely up to you. Do whatever you want. There are no celestial consequences. Imagining this, what would you do? How would you behave? Try it now. Take a few minutes to see what it is like. The first time I did this experiment, it was an uneasy experience. Imagining myself to be the only authority gave me a sensation of wobbly mortality. Principles that had seemed rock solid were swaying in the breeze, and in that moment I did not know how I would choose to act if there were no retribution, no reward, no eventual judgment day. That uncertainty brought into focus the assumptions and dynamics of my ordinary world and made me realize how my eyes too frequently gaze back over my shoulder at the invisible, hovering parents of adult childhood. When I asked friends to imagine the same parentless scenario, I could see it was unfamiliar to them also, even startling and uncomfortable, although they were independent and self-supporting. Adult by all usual criteria. If gods do not occupy the heavens, and wise parents do not heed head governments, if there are no experts without error and prejudice, how can we find our way to a home that is not a dream? The child's home is in the past. We may try to create a home again in the families in which we are parent, wife, husband, and children can provide a place where love is given and received. But as adults, it is not the same because our reality is different. We are far from being the parent we imagined as a child. Pretending doesn't work. Can there be a home for us? The eye-level world is the perspective that arises when the parents in the sky disappear and their image superimposed on other people dissolve and vanish. As you look around, no one towers above you. Everyone looks back at the same human height. Although the parents are gone, the landscape is not threatening. It spreads out in all directions, inviting exploration. It is open and calm, in contrast to the world of childhood fears. The child fears that the disappearance of parents would release anarchy, hatred, and destruction because in the parent's world, child knows no power, no control that is not imposed. In the eye-level world, freedom is of a different kind, more responsible than before because the choices are your own. They are uncoerced and unbribed. Free will is the experience of being the author of the law you obey. This world is different from that shaped by the dependency dream. Although we have no parents in the eye-level world, when we face each other, we find companions. We share the same need for meaning, the same intimations of transcendence, the certainty of death, the saving joy of love. We can sense a new connection, a new linking of equals that makes all of us one family, yet individuals. Only in the eye-level world do we emerge as ourselves, true to our own perceptions and strengths, able to respond realistically to the world that surrounds us. Cult behavior is the expression of the dependency dream. It is a self-deception, more serious than may at first appear. For at this point in history, problems confront us that threaten everyone on Earth. Nuclear weapons, contamination of the environment, spiraling populations. To solve these problems, we need as much realism as possible, and realism is the first casualty of cult behavior. We must leave the security of the cult circle and move forward into the eye-level world, whether we are inclined to lead or follow. Let us hope we can see that cult behavior is too risky, the comfort of its fantasy a lie. Reality may be more uncertain than we wish, but its freedom is a bountiful reward. When the gods and demons disappear, a different world reappears, rich in sunlight and storm, but without fear, standing together on that level plane, we find ourselves in a new home, one that is quite real. There are no outsiders, and it is worth more than any dream.